Hey viewers and listeners, my name's Cara, and today I have a bit of a book review for you. Today I want to talk to you about a book I recently read. It is Witchcraft Activism, A Toolkit for Magical Resistance by David Salisbury. I read this book a couple weeks ago now, or so. Yeah, and I've been waiting to do a review on it, just to kind of let it sink in. And also, firstly, I just want to say I'm surprised that I even was able to get a copy of this through my library system already, because this is a brand new book. It was just published in 2019. So I didn't fully expect that I was going to be able to find it, but I always like to check the library first anyway. And sure enough, the Cleveland Public Library System had a copy. The Cleveland Public Library System is a very big system, though. Lots of libraries are connected together, so there's more of a chance if you're looking in a wider library system that you will find something. And also, maybe it has to do with the fact that it's a system based around a city. Maybe more urban areas are more likely to get books like this a little sooner, not just activism, but also witchcraft in general. I think we're a little more likely to find things like that there than in our rural public libraries. But when I lived in a rural area that the libraries were not connected to the larger city system, I still found books about witchcraft there too. So it really just depends. Wherever you are, check your local public library systems for anything, not just this book, anything you're looking for. And if you live close to one that might be connected to a larger system, definitely check that out. So it's more accessible that way. So I'm really, really happy that this book is accessible through the library system in my area, and I'm going to be returning it as soon as possible after I get this video done so that other people can start reading it. It is published by Weiser Books, which I follow on Instagram. I also now follow the author, David, on Instagram, so you can check out other stuff that they have too. So, Witchcraft Activism, A Toolkit for Magical Resistance. This book is just that. I mean, it says it right there. It's a wonderful title. It's a wonderful subtitle. I want to read you a little bit of what it says on the back of the book here, because the little blurb on the back of the book really is meant to tell you what the book is about, and it does a great job. So I'm going to read this to you to give you a little better idea. Magic to effect change. Social activist and longtime pagan practitioner David Salisbury, and I hope I'm saying that right, David, provides a practical guide to effective, safe, and smart magical activism. Here, David speaks to the growing interest in the worlds of social justice and political activism that can be informed and enlivened by the practice of witchcraft. Increasingly, activists wish to add magical methods to their arsenal, and spellcasters seek to learn how to best use their powers to resist oppression. The worlds of witchcraft and social activism are coming together as never before. There are a lot of things just inherent within that I absolutely love, but I'm going to just talk about the format of the book and the book itself first, and then I'll get into the things that I love and maybe things that I wanted more of, because there's really nothing about this book that I just didn't like. There's maybe things that I wish were slightly different, but only because I love it so much. Okay, so here we go. Firstly, the book is divided into three main categories other than the introduction and the conclusion, which I am the kind of person who always reads the introduction. If there's an introduction, a preface, a prologue, if there's all three of them, like there is in another book that I'm reading right now, I'm going to read all of them. You know, the author wrote them for a reason. If there's a foreword that someone else wrote, that was included in the book for a reason. So I absolutely am of the school of thought that you should read the introduction, preface, prologue, foreword, whatever. Read the book cover to cover. And, it's there for a reason. I know so many people skip over introductions, and I'm not sure why. It's part of the book for a reason. It's introducing the book. So there is an introduction, but then after that, the book is separated into three main sections. The first one is called The Basics, and it covers the basics of the two sections are called Activism in its Many Forms and Magic for Change. So that's right where David is talking about the basics of activism and the many forms that activism can take and how it can be very simple, kind of grassroots methods, simple things like letter writing campaigns, and then on from there. It can get more complex, but it's also these very simple acts that we can be doing all the time. And then talking about the basics of magic for change. So talking about some basic practices of shielding and energy work and things like that, visualization, breath work, things like this. Gets into more of that kind of stuff more in depth, which is why I was having trouble kind of delineating in my mind what was in the basics and what was in this next section, because it really goes more in depth in the next section, which is called Getting to Work, and is broken up into strategizing, building a defense, building an offense, and victory and loss. Victory and loss is actually kind of just a short section talking about that balance, but the other three are sort of more substantial sections. Again, I read this a couple weeks ago, somewhat on purpose too, so that I remember what I remember, what really stands out to me. So strategizing, building a defense, and building an offense all balance out talking about both of those different categories that were covered in basics. So there's the activism side of things, and there's the witchcraft or magic side of things in all of those sections. And then the third main section, is called History and Culture. The subsections are Myths and Lore and Magical Activists in Modern History. So now I'm just going to talk about what I loved and what I would have loved more of, because really the things that I have to say about the history and culture section fall within those other things. So what I love about this book, first of all, it calls itself accessible, I think, on the back cover, and then also in the beginning here, the praise for witchcraft activism written by other authors, other activists, whatever they may be, giving their little praise review of the book. A lot of people use the word accessible, and I think it is. And the other word that I would like to use about this is approachable. It feels very approachable, whether you are coming at it from having the witchcraft background but not so much the activism background, or if you have the activism background but not so much the witchcraft background. I feel like the simple practices that are included from the basics section on into the Getting to Work section, they're all very approachable, and it's very encouraging in that they are simple enough that you really get a sense that you could start doing this right now. You can start utilizing these techniques and practices right now, and I think that that is so cool. Full disclosure, for any of you watching this video who might not already know me, you might get a sense from my username being Cute Witch, but I come from a little bit more of the witchcraft background, and I don't consider myself to have a very huge or deep background experience with activism. I would consider myself sort of in the lower rungs of that, I suppose. Letter writing, signing petitions, talking to friends about causes, going to some little events and things, but David talks in the book about that and the activism in its many forms thing, talking about those forms, and that, demonstrations can come in many flavors, and it's not always just a march or a protest, things like that, but really does call it out, because I felt called out by this, or called in by this even, that people tend to think that activism is just going to a protest and being on that picket line, and that's not what it is. And I realized sort of by reading that I did also have that sort of idea in my head, even though I have a lot of friends who are activists, and I know that these other things are also activism. I also still held that sort of stereotype in my mind as part of my conditioning. So, but yeah, this street activism, marching and demonstrating, that's a lot of when people think of activism, that's what they think of, is taking it to the streets. And so I love that. I love that it's very encouraging that, that's not the only type of activism there is. And if you're doing those other sorts of things, you're still helping. And then you can really just feel like if you haven't ever done that stuff before, you can get in on those ground levels and take it from there and build from there. And who knows where you'll end up, right? So I love that. I love that it's simple things. I love that it feels encouraging. I love that this book multiple times, and also in some of the praise in the beginning, some of the people talking about the book say witchcraft is political. I just love that it comes out and says that and talks about how witchcraft has always been about these things. It's always been about giving power to the oppressed and standing up for what's right and having to do with social justice. And, magic is about change. There are various definitions that people use, but we say that magic is the art of creating change, and different words in that definition might change. Some people call it the art and science. There might be more words after that, causing change in accordance with the will, whatever. But whatever it is, magic is about change. And that's why I love this here on the back of the book, magic to effect change, which is, of course, what magic essentially is. When you want something to change in your life, that's what you're doing magic to do. And so I love that. And I love that in the front of the book, Laura Tempest Zakroff has a little bit here in the praise section that begins, witchcraft is inherently political. The work naturally highlights the connections between us as human beings and the world around us. And then various times throughout the book, David talks about that in their opinion, and in mine as well, that, the idea of the personal being political, and what is political is inherently personal. And that is something that as a kid, I didn't get, When I was younger, I thought I didn't like politics. I didn't have anything to do with politics. They had nothing to do with me. And only as I got older and started sort of realizing, acknowledging, and then embracing my various identities did I realize that just in being myself am I a political being, and that my life is affected by politics and also affects the political realm. So I love that. I love that this book comes out and says, hey, witchcraft is political, and this is about witchcraft activism and magical resistance. It's a thing. It's a thing people are doing, and you can do it too. I love also that this book mentions by word, by name, I suppose you could say, animal rights, because there are so many books that I read that come from a magical social justice standpoint that will talk at length about human rights and environmental rights, but when they talk about environmental rights, they're specifically concentrating on the planet as a whole, or like the plant life. And a lot of people, I think, include animals when they talk about the environment. Like in their mind, they think, well, yeah, animals are part of the environment. But there are so few that I've seen that really just come out and name, oh yeah, by the way, this also includes animal rights, and this book does. So I really appreciate that. It's not like it's a huge section in here or anything, but honestly, just mentioning it like 2 or 3 times in a list, human rights, animal rights, environmental rights, to kind of broaden that spectrum and touch on those specific elements so that the animals aren't just getting lumped in with the environment, but that they're important to in and of themselves, right along with human rights and environmental rights, not putting one above the other, but really just all of these things are concerns of ours. So I love that. Even just little tiny mentions stood out to me because so many other people kind of skip over it. They skip over the animals. So thank you, David. I love that. Okay, so this is where I said I was going to talk about the third section, which is myths and lore, and then magical activists in modern history. And this is a little bit of where it also comes into the what I might have wanted more of in this book, or just differently. And like, who am I to say, right? I'm just a person reading it. I love this book as it exists regardless. But so for example, in the myths section, There's sort of like what feels like an introduction to, like, we're about to talk about the myths and lore of magical activism. And here's a little look at, just some basic stuff. And then, okay, here's the first one. And talks about the first one, which is Aradia, or a Gospel of the Witches. Totally cool. I have that book, and is a really good example, talks about it in a really enlightening way, I think. And then, you turn the page and you're ready for the next one, and that's it. And then it goes into magical activists and modern history. And so at that point I was like, I wanted more myths. Like the discussion of Aradia was so good and so juicy, like really David's personal connections with like why Aradia is so important, that I wanted more, and there weren't any more, and it went on to magical activists. So I just feel like, in that regard, it's just our responsibility to then go out there and find the other ones, because there definitely are others. But yeah, so that's one thing where I was kind of like, oh, okay, that's over. It was just abruptly over. And then moving into magical activists in modern history, I felt like at first that I was reading an entirely different book. This last section, the whole myths and lore and magical activists in modern history section, what is it called? History and culture. The whole history and culture section feels like a different book to me. And it might be because I read this on 3 different days, the 3 sections. So I read the basics first, and then I read getting to work the next day, and then I read history and culture the 3rd day. So maybe it was that I was a little bit removed from it. I don't know. But when I started reading it, I felt like this is a different book. This feels very different, because the first 2 sections are really like these basic, simple practices that really encouraging you that you can be a part of this, you can do this now, and here's some general ways that you can start doing that. This very approachable kind of personal, it really feels like you could be standing there on the street in the moment with David teaching you like, okay, yeah, just do this. And you're like, okay, cool, yeah, I'm doing this right now. Awesome. And then there's the history section. It just feels very different. However, I will say, after I had that initial reaction, but I just kept reading it, eventually I got so engrossed in the interesting history, both of names that I had heard before, but I didn't know that much about their involvement in activism throughout history, or that I didn't know had really any more occult connections or other things that I didn't realize they were doing with their magic in an activist sense, and names that I'd never heard before that I was really interested to hear about. So I did get very engrossed in it, and then I was like, okay, yes, this is definitely part of the same book. It makes sense, but just at first, it has a very different feel, because it goes from like very simple, conversational toolkit teaching to now here's a lesson in our history, which I love and think is very important though. So if you're like me and you have that reaction when you read through the book, just keep going. It's part of it. It's an important part of it, and I'm glad that it's here. I'm glad it's in this book. I also love that it is separated into sections of history. So it talks about early America, deism and Freemasonry, and then the 19th century, Romanticism, spiritualism, and women's suffrage. Then the first half of the 20th century and the second half of the 20th century are separated. The second half being flower power, sexual revolution, and feminism. And then it goes into the 21st century and today. So I love that. I love that it's broken up. I also love, in that same vein, that the resources, recommended reading, the recommended reading of the book is also separated into subsections by subject matter, which I love. It's not something that you see very often. But so this is separated into books on practical magic, paganism, and revolution, esoteric activism and politics and history and culture, activism and social justice as social sciences. The first book of that section is actually also sitting right here on my dining room table, because my partner has read it and is currently rereading it. And it is The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness by Michelle Alexander. And so this is a book that is recommended by this, and it's in the social sciences section. So I love that. And then there's a section on building magical skills that are useful to the activist witch. So there's, just like the basics section breaks it down, here's your activism basics, here's your magical basics. The glossary also includes words that are important to know from both sides. So it's got, alchemy right next to burnout, followed by civil disobedience and cone of power. So it intermingling these activist terms with witchcraft terms. So no matter which area you're coming from, you're learning a little bit about the other side. And I would imagine if you're coming at this book with no experience in either one of these realms, witchcraft nor activism, I imagine that it would be a pretty good introduction for those people as well. I would love to hear from anyone for whom that is your experience. Because again, as I said, I come from a little bit more of the witchcraft background with a little bit of activism. I have a lot of friends who are much more activism based and don't know as much about the witchcraft, so I would love to hear their views on this in the future, or anyone else who is also in that boat. But yeah, just as much, anyone who isn't really familiar with either of these realms, I would love to hear what they think about this book and how it introduces these concepts. The other thing that I would say I just wanted more of is that I kind of just wanted more book. It's so short. It's fewer than 200 pages entirely, like including the glossary and the recommended reading and the bibliography. It's less than 180 pages. So once I got to that third section about history and culture, I was like, this feels like a different book. This feels weird. But then, like I said, I got so into it. And then when you finish that, I was just like, that's it? I want more. I want there to be more book. However, I also think that the length that it is perfect for what it is. So I actually don't want this book to be any longer, even though I would have, when you read it, you want more, but I think that's good. That's such a good thing. So it's an experience that I had, but it's not something I would actually change, if that makes sense. So David, I think you've done a great job here. Thank you so much for this book. The other thing that I love about it is that even in the basics, for any of you like me who are coming from the witchcraft type background, more so than the activist side, even the basic things that are like, things we already know, David teaches such different ways of going about them. So there's still new practices for the same basic concepts that I didn't know, things that I learned from this book, different ways of going about your defensive magic, different ways of visualizing your personal shielding. And so I think that's cool. I always think that's cool. So I think this is good. Even for anybody who has experience in both of these areas, there's people in the front in their praise that mentioned that. So, I can't really speak to that myself. You have to really take it at the word of people who consider themselves well-versed in both of these areas, and they say that it is good as well. So, if we can believe them, then we're all set. I love that it has symbols and all kinds of practical knowledge. It includes some tarot spreads in one of the areas, so that if you are someone who incorporates divination, there's a little bit for you there. There's a little bit about sigils and symbols. There's a little bit of everything, and so I love it. I really enjoyed this book. Thank you, David. So again, I would love to know other people's thoughts if you're coming at it from the sort of flip side background, or if you are brand new to both of these types of worlds, if you're extremely well versed in both of these types of worlds, everybody. I want to know everybody's point of view, even if you have a very similar background to me where you're like, yeah, I know the witchcraft and I know a little bit of the activism, but not as much. So just because it's a viewpoint that I already have doesn't mean that I'm not interested in hearing yours as well, because we're different people, so we're going to react to these things differently. So yeah, let us know your thoughts in the comments, and by us, I mean me and everyone else watching and who would be reading your comments, and also David. So thank you so much for watching. Let me just look at my notes and see if I forgot anything else. No, I think it's good. So thank you so much, David, for writing this book. Thank you all for watching or listening to this video, and I will see you next time. Until then, don't forget to be awesome, blessed be, and goodbye.